Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So here today to talk about 3 vampire books that I read recently. Quite a rare thing for me to read something so supernatural and spooky, or even to read something particularly seasonal. I've said before, I'm not typically a very seasonal reader, purely because a lot of the time I feel very restricted by my ever-growing TBR, and therefore buying more books than I need just to fulfill like a seasonal feeling seems a little bit excessive. But I did say in my September wrap-up that I read and enjoyed Dracula by Bram Stoker, and it's been a couple of weeks since I finished Dracula. I'd been kind of mulling it over in my mind. I'd been like writing out notes of what I wanted to talk about in a video about it. I'd also been listening to a couple of podcasts, a BBC History Extra podcast which was all about Dracula at 125 years old, because it is a significant anniversary for this book. And then I also re-listened to the You're Dead to Me podcast about vampires in Gothic fiction, because I do think generally if you're not really into your literary history, then a lot of people do consider Dracula to be the first vampire book. But if you are into your literary history, if you've studied like the 18th, 19th century in literature, you know that that's not technically true. A creature akin to vampires have long existed in mythology, going back thousands of years. They did frequently appear in poetry, and there was a whole vampire craze in the 1720s to 1730s in literature. And vampire crazes in literature did recur up until Dracula was published. And there were pieces of vampire fiction that very much inspired Dracula, particularly John Polidori's The Vampire, simply titled. It is often cited as the first vampire story. There's also Carmilla by Sheridan Fanu, which was published in 1879. It's a novella, which a lot of people think that Bram Stoker was kind of riffing off, kind of commenting on, changing things that he didn't like in there. And I started looking into them just out of curiosity, and I won't lie to you, the main reason that I ended up reading both of them in quite quick succession is because they are both really short. One of them is a short story, one of them is a novella. I read them both in the space of one morning and I was very pleased about it. Just had a very lovely spooky morning reading vampire books. And it was just a really fun process of getting to know a little bit more about these vampire books and this area of Gothic fiction which I've not really explored before. My personal main exposure to vampires has been through like Twilight. It's been through the movie A Little Vampire that I watched when I was a kid. That's actually where a lot of my preconceptions about Bram Stoker's Dracula came from. Aside from that, you know, I'm quite an easily spooked person, so I've never really ventured into vampires in fiction. But yeah, I thought today I would talk about these 3 recent reads, what I thought about them, similarities and differences, different tropes that crop up in all of them, because I think my little mini course on vampires has been quite a successful one. I definitely have my preferences, but they've all been really interesting reads. First off, we have the short story The Vampire by John Polidori. As I say, this came out in 1819, famously written as a result of the ghost story contest that was held by Lord Byron, Percy and Mary Shelley while they were staying in Geneva. That infamous contest that also gave us Frankenstein, one of my personal favourite books. I believe it was originally published under Lord Byron's name, which gave it a lot of popularity, but Lord Byron famously disliked it because he could see a lot of similarities between the vampire character and himself. And I must say, I'm surprised I didn't realise that Lord Byron was so self-aware. In this short story, we meet a young man called Aubrey, who whilst in London ends up coming across the mysterious Lord Ruthven. Together they decide that they're both going to venture out on their grand tour of Europe, to which one of my favourite moments in this book is John Polidori kind of commenting on the grand tour, and about how it isn't really for intellectual pursuits, but just so that young men can expose themselves to as many vices as possible and make sure that any rumours that are floating around about them once they return are actually true. Whilst travelling in Greece, Aubrey becomes very disillusioned with Lord Ruthven, especially after he finds him cavorting with a young innkeeper's daughter, and also just generally finding him a bit odd. Later it's discovered that Ianthe, the young daughter, has been found murdered, notably with a quite grisly neck wound. Ruthven and Aubrey do end up meeting again, but they're set upon on the road by a bunch of highwaymen. Lord Ruthven is evidently mortally wounded and he dies, making Aubrey promise never to mention his death at least for a year and a day. Aubrey goes back to London, reunites with his sister, and then suddenly finds that Lord Ruthven is still alive. How could this be? Could it be because he's a vampire? A short story really about the dangers of lads on tour. Out of the 3 books that I've read, this one feels the most distinct in its style and also in its depiction of the vampire. For one, I think it's notable that this is the only one in which we see an English vampire. Carmilla takes place in Austria, whereas Dracula predominantly takes place in England, but Dracula himself is foreign. So you can definitely see where commentary on vampires and foreignness are at play in these books, this commentary of fear of the unknown. Whereas in this story, we've got an Englishman or an English vampire preying upon a young Greek girl, and who knows who else he's ended up seducing and preying upon. A theme that this shares with the the other stories on this list is that vampires seem to be inevitably tied up with seduction, and the victims of the vampires are often victims of seduction. I would say out of all of the ones that I read, this is probably my least favourite. I think the fact that it is a short story kind of hinders it. It's incredibly pacey, but sometimes you feel like you're just running through these events and never getting time to linger on any emotions, on any impacts. You don't really get much time to sit with any of these characters. And also you don't get moments where you get to learn more about the lore of vampires in whatever world Polidori created. And sometimes it's just quite nice to be able to read about what other people have discovered about these vampires, but we don't really get much vampire lore in this book. There's notably so much less speech in here. Most of the talking does seem to come from Ruffin himself, so it does overall feel much less personal, especially compared to Dracula, where you really feel like you get to get a sense of these characters and their relationships to each other. Out of all of them, although there is only really like one grisly scene, one scene where we see a victim at death, it is much more gory than the subsequent books from the Victorian period. And this vampire seems to inflict an instant death, an immediate death, as opposed to the slightly slower, more drawn out illnesses that you see from the victims in Carmilla and in Dracula. Which is actually how I always had pictured vampires, which is that if they suck your blood, you are either going to turn into a vampire or you instantly die. This one is also notable for having a truly unhappy ending in which the vampire gets away with it and wins whilst our heroes die. So yeah, for me, this is probably my least favourite of the three that I read, but it's really good to have as a reference point and having this as a point of comparison to later books. Next up we have Carmilla. This was published between 1871 and 1872. It is a novella written by Irish author Sheridan. Fanu. We meet our main character of Laura, who lives in Austria in a castle. Her mother has died, but she lives with her father, and also this quite eclectic bunch of people who are from like France and Germany. It's a multilingual household. We hear about how when she was 6 years old, she had an odd dream, a young woman entering her bedchamber and absolutely entrancing her. Upon alerting members of her household, she tells them that she's got puncture wounds in her breast, but when they examine her, they can't find these puncture wounds. And from then until the age of 14, she's carefully guarded while she sleeps. Years later, Laura is a young woman, and following a carriage incident outside Laura's home, the family end up taking in a young injured woman who's very beautiful and mysterious. There seems to be an instant attraction between Laura and this young woman Carmilla, and Carmilla tells Laura that she's sure that she's seen her before. Carmilla is very charming and attractive, and Laura is so taken with her, so dazzled by her. Laura starts to feel very dependent on her. There's definitely like this codependent relationship going on. However, around her, mysterious things are happening and people are turning up dead. Carmilla is very famous for being one of the very first lesbian vampire stories, because there is definitely this increased relationship between Carmilla and Laura, which is certainly very lustful. Laura, as I say, becomes very codependent, and there are definitely signs of this being a very toxic relationship. Carmilla really exploiting Laura's naivety and wanting her to become dependent on her. And I really like Carmilla as a vampire, especially in comparison to Dracula, mainly because you get to see much more of Carmilla and you get to see this relationship develop. Dracula you only really get to see in the first like 50 pages or so, and then he's a presence who pops up every now and then. He's a constant fear, there's constant tension that he might approach, but we rarely get to see him on the page. And you know, he has to wait until people's guards are down and they're asleep to attack, whereas Carmilla can really lure people in through her conversation, through her beauty and her charm. And I think this is definitely the template for a lot of these sexy, seductive vampires that we get to see nowadays. And like I say, I do think that this novella has a lot to say about toxic relationships. I think in comparison to Dracula and the Vampire, where there is much more commentary on like foreign invasion, in Polidori it's an English vampire coming and preying upon European women. In Dracula it's a Transylvanian vampire coming over to England and corrupting the young women. I think most of the commentary comes in the form of class. Carmilla likes to let everybody know that she comes from noble lineage, and it's notable how dismissive she is of poorer members of society, and especially of their suspicions that there is some evil presence lurking within the town, which proves to be correct. Very reminiscent of Jonathan Harker's dismissal of the suspicions of the citizens of Transylvania, that he shouldn't be going to Dracula's castle. I think it's very notable that all of our vampires that appear in these three books are wealthy, or at least if they're not wealthy, they may be titled or of some sort of noble lineage. And I think this is really interesting. Obviously, a lot of these vampires are immortal, so they have a lot of time to accumulate their wealth and their reputations. And I think it's interesting how this makes them very desirable and aspirational. And it's only when you get to know them a little bit more that you realise that they're really leeching off other people around them, exploiting the lives of people who are much more vulnerable. And I think that's a really interesting commentary on society, you know? As I've said before, this and Twilight constitute the extent of my vampire knowledge, so if you can tell me about any poor vampires, I would love to know about them. But this is just definitely a trend that I've seen. Once again, like the Vampire, because it is a much shorter story, this is a novella as opposed to the like 600-page tome that Dracula is, you are kind of speeding through events, not as bad as the Vampire, but you are definitely not having a lot of time to linger on any particular occasion. As a result, I do tend to prefer the character relationships in Dracula and how that's able to expand upon this mystery, really build up an atmosphere and a tension throughout that book. But I do want to reiterate that I I think that overall Carmilla is a much better, much more engaging, interesting vampire than Dracula. And like I say, it is purely due to the fact that we have more of her presence on the page and how we get to see her relationship to the main character of Laura continue. I'd also say that the first 2/3 of this novella were really fantastic. I really enjoyed the tension, the relationship between Laura and Carmilla, but I do think the ending was a little bit weird and rushed. I think I'm remembering right that the downfall of Carmilla is kind of told by another person. We don't really get to see it at work, which then leads us very nicely on to Dracula. Published in 1897, written by Bram Stoker. This is a chunky boy, and a lot of vampire media returns to a lot of the tropes that were set up in this book. This one, out of all of them, I think has the most interesting style, in that it is told primarily through letters and occasional reports, and these letters are written by many different characters, and as a result I feel like you're able to get a much better sense of these characters' personalities, how they interact with each other. Obviously you have the kind of Princess Diaries problem of you start to think, you're spending a lot of time writing these diaries and really transcribing everything that happened and every word that every person said. Is that realistic? But really you get so much into the story that I think you want that extra detail. This book begins with lawyer Jonathan Harker going over to Transylvania upon direct order from his manager. He's there to help the Count Dracula arrange his affairs so that he may depart from his castle in Transylvania and move to London. Before he arrives in Dracula's castle, he comes up against a lot of townsfolk who, when they find out where he is going, are warning him not to go. And they present him with lots of different objects in order to keep him safe, including a crucifix that he is directed to wear around his neck. Harker is initially quite dismissive of these warnings. He goes to meet Dracula and is initially quite charmed by him, doesn't see anything amiss, but as he spends more time at Dracula's castle, he learns more about Dracula's routine, notably that he doesn't ever seem to eat anything and never seems to meet him outside the nighttime. The more that he stays and the more that he witnesses of Dracula's comings and goings, the more perturbed he is, and then very soon he realizes that he has been trapped there. One night he's left terrified as 3 vampire women come to suck his blood, only repelled by Dracula's intervention. We then are transported to England, where we come across 2 young women, Lucy and Mina. Mina being the fiancée of Jonathan Harker. They've gone on holiday to the northern coastal town of Whitby, and whilst their strange goings-on seem to be occurring, Lucy and Mina go their separate ways, and Lucy becomes very gravely ill. In order to determine what is wrong with Lucy, one of Lucy's admirers, Dr. John Seward, decides to enlist the help of his former professor, Dr. Van Helsing. Van Helsing comes and looks over Lucy and determines that what is wrong with her is she has been attacked by a vampire. And so they're basically working around the clock to save Lucy's life and also destroy this vampire threat. This was a really interesting read to me. I was actually surprised at how much I enjoyed it, especially, like I say, I'm not really much of like a spooky horror, supernatural kind of reader. But I think maybe because I was going into this with some prior knowledge, like I knew that it was a vampire. I knew some of the tropes, like using garlic to repel vampires, using the crucifix. It's very interesting to read a classic work when you know a lot of the tropes, but you don't actually know the whole plot. I knew kind of where we were going, but I didn't really know how we got there. And that was really good because it meant that there was still this air of mystery and of tension. And I think that's what Bram Stoker is really good at building in this. Even though I kind of knew where it was going to end, I knew that Dracula was going to be killed at the end, but I was still kind of like, oh god, what's going to happen before this happens? I really enjoy how this book kind of explores technological advances, particularly in regards to science and travel, and how medical advancement and travel such as trains and ships kind of enhances the plot and enables the characters to defeat this enemy. It's also a very interesting book due to a lot of the ambiguities within certain themes with this book. When I was listening to the podcast episode about Dracula at 125 years old, the historian on there was talking about how you could read this book from both like a very liberal perspective but also from a very conservative perspective, especially when it comes to portrayals of the role of women and also of the foreign. There's a lot of commentary in Dracula about how women need to be protected by men, about how, you know, they're very delicate little creatures, but at the same time there's also commentary on this idea of the new woman, and especially in regards to sexual behaviour and also learning, and these things are kind of shown in kind of mixed lights. You could see Bram Stoker praising and also condemning this new woman in different ways through this narrative. The character of Lucy is shown to be the most sexually desirous, and a moment that a lot of people cite is when she is trying to pick between the 3 men who are all admirers of her, picking one of those men to marry, and she kind of makes an offhand comment about, oh, I wish I could just marry all 3 of them. And it's very notable that after she has confirmed this, she has ended up being attacked by Dracula, and she ends up being the one to die. A lot of the ways that Van Helsing and her admirers try and save her, and subsequently ultimately have to kill her when she becomes a vampire are kind of sexually coded. All three of her admirers end up transfusing blood to her to save her life, and then later when they are staking her, you know, you can kind of see the sexual connotations there. At the same time, I would never say that the depiction of Lucy is really negative. She always appears like a very lovely woman, and everybody around her loves her and deeply mourns her. But at the same time, you do have this dynamic of she's expressed a sexual desire and therefore she must pay. We then have Mina, who's kind of the embodiment of this intellectual new woman. She's the one who transcribes Jonathan Harker's diaries and letters. She has an encyclopedic knowledge of the timetables of the trains, which ends up being a massive aid. She's just this repository for information, and she ends up being praised and admired for that. One of my favourite scenes in this book is when she initially meets Van Helsing, and Van Helsing kind of meets her. He's kind of admiring of her, you know, in her position as the woman of the house, and is kind of making this commentary on, you know, how vulnerable and delicate women are. And she surprises him by mentioning that she has a lot of knowledge about this vampire threat, that she's transcribed all of Jonathan's letters and diaries. And she kind of plays a trick on him. When he asks her if he can see these, she produces the shorthand that she had used because she knows shorthand, but Van Helsing does not. And when he reads it, he's like, oh, I don't know what this means. And so she has to be like, lol, only joking, here's the actual long form. And he's just there like, I see what you did there, Madam Mina. You fooled me. And yet as a woman, Mina is still vulnerable to Dracula. She is still preyed upon, she is still vulnerable, and it takes the men in her life to save her. Similarly, there's a very mixed message when it comes to the foreigner. There are definitely very negative depictions of Romani people in this book, and this idea of like the foreignness of Dracula, and this idea that he's coming to England to invade it and to pollute English women. However, at the same time, when Jonathan Harker goes to Transylvania, it is the Transylvanian townspeople who are helping him, who have this insight and knowledge that he's just ignoring. It's also very notable that the person who has the most knowledge of vampires is the Dutch Van Helsing. He leads the charge and is the one who is able to provide most of the expertise in order to find and kill Dracula, along with another foreigner, the American Quincy, who is one of Lucy's former lovers, who also joins the hunt to find Dracula. It's a very mixed message, and I guess what you come out of it is this idea of what is the right kind of foreigner. And I think it's probably the aspect of Dracula that is aged the worst. But like I say, I do think it's really interesting for these ambiguities. Out of all of the vampire books that I've read, this is definitely my favourite. It is definitely a very, very long book, and you can feel its length. However, I don't think I'm going to forget having started this book like quite late at night and feeling kind of terrified whilst reading it, because Bram Stoker is able to evoke this atmosphere so well. And because a lot of the story takes place at night, a lot of the pivotal events happen at night, I actually went to bed kind of afraid to go to sleep, lest Dracula come into my room and suck my blood. I think that is a real skill on the part of the author. So there we go. I think those are all the things that I had to say today about these 3 19th century vampire books that I read. Definitely a different kind of reading experience for me, but I really enjoyed it. I don't know if this is going to be the precursor to me reading more vampire books in the future. I think a lot of it is that I just find the literary history around the vampire really interesting. What it has to say about wider society, about literary trends, it's really, really interesting. But I do think I am still quite a lightweight when it comes to horror and gore. Do let me know if you've read any of these books or if you're interested in reading them. Any recommendations of further books or podcasts or anything that I could listen to or read. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks.